Hey guys, it's Will. It's Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. I hope you like the content. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you feel like subscribing, that would be a huge help. Thank you so much. What are we here to talk about today? Actually, something I'm really excited to talk about because I don't get to talk about it a lot on this channel. So I am a huge fan of Cyberpunk, if you don't know that. I love... in my mind, there's like kind of two categories of Cyberpunk. There's like the Blade Runner hardcore Cyberpunk, which I think of as like Blade Runner, The Matrix, like Nemesis, that kind of stuff, Ghost in the Shell, Akira. And then there's like the Cyberpunk stuff that's more our world setting, but bringing Cyberpunk tech into the recognizable world that we live in, which would be like Terminator, Terminator 2, RoboCop, like those types of movies. But I am a huge, huge fan. And I guess Demolition Man kind of sits between those two, right? I'm a huge fan of Cyberpunk. And for my birthday this year, I got Blade Runner 2049 on Blu-ray. I haven't seen this film since about when it came out. I didn't see it in theaters, but I saw it not long thereafter when it first came out on streaming. And so I wanted to rewatch it. I got this Blu-ray, and I watched it 4 times last week. I did, and it blew my mind. This movie is incredible. I'm not going to have to talk about it because what I'm here to talk about is something else. I was watching the bonus features on that Blu-ray, and Ridley Scott, in speaking about the first Blade Runner film, said this.
I was shooting in Hong Kong 40 years ago. Castle Peak in Kowloon. It was dangerous, but it was fantastic. And I always thought that was the world of Blade Runner.
And that really blew my mind, right? Because Blade Runner has a long connection to Hong Kong. I'll talk about, or a very strong connection to Hong Kong. The kind of Blade Runner as an intellectual property has had a long connection to Hong Kong, going back to the 80s, obviously, because that's when the first film was made. But I had never thought of Cyberpunk and Hong Kong. Let me explain the reasoning for this. I lived in Tokyo, and obviously, when you look at Blade Runner, it's got a lot of Japanese writing in it, and when you look at stuff like Akira and Ghost in the Shell, those are based on, they're Japanese films that are based on Japanese comics. And so when I think of like neon-lit future city East Asia, and when I think of kind of the cyberpunk environment, I think of Japan. Because I lived there, and because you see Japanese writing in a lot of these films, and because a lot of the really key pieces of cyberpunk, like Ghost in the Shell and Akira, are Japanese, or films like The Matrix, is very heavily influenced by anime and other Japanese stuff, right? So this was like the first time I really associated cyberpunk in Hong Kong, and this light went off in my head, and I was like, wait a minute. This makes total sense. So I actually started doing some research. I found a quote from Ridley Scott, I believe speaking to the LA Times, in, I think, 1992. And he said, let me find the exact quote for you here. So Ridley Scott credits Edward Hopper's painting Nighthawks and the French science fiction comics magazine Metal Hurrant, to which the artist John Giergard, I don't speak French, so I don't know how to pronounce his name, and I apologize for that, contributed as a stylistic mood sources. However, he also drew on the landscape of, quote, Hong Kong on a very bad day. And he said that that was heavily influential in creating the world and the mood of the film Blade Runner. Now, Blade Runner is actually, technically, you can see this on Wikipedia, go read the Wikipedia page for Blade Runner, a Hong Kong film, because it was in part produced by Run Run Shaw and Shaw Brothers, which makes it a co-production. So it is an American, I believe American/Hong Kong film. And Blade Runner being, I don't think that anyone would disagree with the idea that Blade Runner is the visual cinematic template for cyberpunk. And it's a Hong Kong movie. And not a lot of people talk about that. And now that I've heard Ridley Scott say that, and I make that connection, I start to realize how much of cyberpunk is rooted in Hong Kong. So, earlier this year, I rewatched the anime Ghost in the Shell, right? Now, I've read Ghost in the Shell, the manga. I haven't read the whole thing, but I read like the first big graphic novel series or compilation or whatever it is. That is very clearly set in Japan. Everyone has Japanese names. They talk about different cities in Japan. They travel around Japan. It's very Japanese, right? When I rewatched the movie, I hadn't seen that movie in probably about 10 years. When I rewatched the movie, what I realized was the characters are Japanese, and some of the cultural references are Japanese, but the city really looks like Hong Kong. So I get on the internet and I Google Ghost in the Shell Hong Kong, and this is what I find. Oshii, who is the director of the film, um, Mamoru Oshii is his name. Oshii based the setting for Ghost in the Shell on Hong Kong. Oshii commented that his first thought to find an image of the future setting was an Asian city, but finding a suitable cityscape of the future would be impossible, and so he chose the real streets of Hong Kong as his model. He also said that Hong Kong was the perfect subject and theme for the film, with its countless signs and the cacophony of sounds. The film's mecha designer, Takeuchi Atsushi, noted that while the film does not have a chosen setting, it is obviously based on Hong Kong because the city represented the theme of the film and the old and the new, which exists in a strange relationship in an age of information deluge. Before shooting the film, the artists drew sketches that emphasize Hong Kong's chaotic, confusing, and overwhelming aspects. So Ghost in the Shell, the film, the setting is based on Hong Kong, even though they never explicitly tell you where it takes place. The 2017 live, I'm not going to get into the politics of the live action Ghost in the Shell film. I'm just going to state for the record, in talking about Cyberpunk in Hong Kong, that the 2017 Ghost in the Shell live action film was shot in Hong Kong. And I believe it takes place in Hong Kong because they make reference to Japanese characters being immigrants, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, so they're clearly taking influence from the anime and setting the live action film in Hong Kong. Now, something else worth noting is that when the Wachowskis first set out to make The Matrix, what they wanted to do was make a live action adaptation to Ghost in the Shell, but they couldn't get the rights to it. And so they wrote an original script based on similar ideas. And you can really see that, right? Like the consciousness is this thing that exists over here and the body exists over here, and they come together and there's this world that they're projected into. Like you kind of see how they're similar, right? Even though there are obviously key differences in what they're about and the themes and stuff like that. But it's interesting that The Matrix takes influence from Ghost in the Shell, when Ghost in the Shell is the film is very influenced by Hong Kong. Right now, obviously, The Matrix is influenced by anime, but The Matrix is hugely influenced by John Woo. Right? And you see that everywhere in The Matrix, and by, I would argue, other types of Hong Kong films too, like martial arts films. Obviously, you have like the scene in the dojo where they're fighting each other, and there's a lot of martial arts and a lot of wire work, and Yuen Woo-ping did the choreography for those films, and so there's really strong connections between The Matrix and Hong Kong cinema, not just in terms of its influence, but in terms of, Colin Chu is in the second and third Matrix film, so there's very strong connections there in terms of the talent involved, as well as clearly taking influence from Hong Kong cinema. Another piece of Cyberpunk that I really love, that I think is kind of an underrated film and an underseen film, is Nemesis. Nemesis was put out on Blu-ray by MVD Rewind Collection. I highly recommend getting that release. It has the DVD and the Blu-ray, and it has a ton of bonus features on it. And it's just a really great, underrated movie. And that movie, to me, is like the missing link between John Woo and The Matrix. Like, there is no way that Albert Pune was not hugely influenced by John Woo. I also see Girls with Guns influence on that film. But I would be really surprised if the Wachowskis hadn't seen Nemesis before making The Matrix, because there's so many parallels. Like the Agent Smith character, there's a very clear precedent for in Nemesis, and like the wearing the suits and the trench coats, and like, which again, I know is a John Woo thing, but like, what Nemesis does is it takes from John Woo and it puts it in an American film that is a cyberpunk film. There's no way that the Wachowskis were not aware of that film when they made The Matrix. But again, heavy influence from John Woo, Girls with Guns, and Hong Kong cinema on that cyberpunk. So I was just kind of thinking about these things, and I decided to go online and I Googled Hong Kong cyberpunk, and I found an article on a website called Chatterus, which I don't really know anything about, but it's called Cyberpunk: How Hong Kong Helped Define a Genre. And it talks about Blade Runner, kind of the similar stuff that I've talked about on here. But one thing that I found really interesting that I didn't think of before, like I said, I'm a huge fan of Akira. I've read the manga, and I have the Blu-ray, and I've seen the movie countless times. I'm going to show you some screenshots here that are taken from this article. So full credit to this article. I will put a link in the description of this video to this article. It compares a skyline shot of Hong Kong to a skyline shot of Akira, and it is remarkable how similar they look. And there's not really a point to this video in terms of trying to, and I don't have a thesis. I'm not trying to convince you of something. I thought it was so interesting to hear that quote from Ridley Scott. And then, like I said, this light just went off in my head. And I started thinking about all these connections between Cyberpunk and Hong Kong. And the fact that I love Cyberpunk. I really love it. And I have never associated it with Hong Kong, but I love all this Hong Kong stuff. And now I'm realizing that there's this overlap, and it's like these two worlds that I love so much coming together. I just think it's so cool. And like, I'm a big fan of music too that's influenced by Cyberpunk. So like, I love Perturbator, and Mike, actually, who's, you know, my partner in this channel, got me into Perturbator and all that stuff, like Ghost and who are the other artists in that genre? Carpenter Brute, Cyber Thing, right? Yeah, and like all that kind of stuff. So my name is Will. It's Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society. This is just a quick video to kind of talk about this thing that I think is really fun. So let me know what you think in the comments. I thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.